Pop culture is filled with all kinds of supernatural entities, ranging from vampires and werewolves to other hybrid monsters and Cthulhu creatures. Among these, vampires have been a fan favorite right from the time they were first introduced in Bram Stoker's Dracula, and they've retained their popularity status even in recent modern-day adaptations of these entities. One such film adaptation was the 2007 American horror film 30 Days of Night, which was inspired by IDW Publishing's comic series with the same name. The film was directed by David Slade, and it followed a bunch of vampires as they wrought havoc on an Alaskan town over the course of a 30-day-long polar night. The film's success was soon followed by a prequel miniseries, a sequel miniseries, as well as a straight-to-home video sequel film, but it's been forgotten over time. Today, we'll be exploring these underrated, long-forgotten Nosferatu from 30 Days of Night in great detail and tell you everything about them. Origins and inspiration. The Nosferatu in 30 Days of Night are largely based on the vampires in the original comic series, which was written by Steve Niles and illustrated by Ben Templesmith for IDW Publishing. Over the course of 3 issues, these vampires took advantage of the 30-day-long polar night in Barrow, Alaska, where the sun does not rise for an entire month during the winter. These vampires soon flock together and use the darkness to their advantage to terrorize the town and openly feed on the townsfolk. According to their lore, the Nosferatu were ruled by a council of elders that consisted of some of their oldest members for the longest time. However, most of them were persecuted in a rebellion orchestrated by humanity when humans first learned about their existence. The council realized that their decision to declare their existence to humanity was a grave mistake, and most of their species were eradicated soon after. Over the course of the next millennium, Vincente led the handful of surviving Nosferatu as they tried to operate in the shadows of the night to satiate their thirst. In general literature, vampires were initially inspired by Bram Stoker's creation, Count Dracula, and then later reincarnated for newer generations. Many themes such as sexuality, nudity, violence, and eroticism define certain eras in vampire fiction, and films and books have explored them in various genres, ranging from horror to comedy. One specific subgenre of vampires depicted them as terrifying, simple-minded entities that focused on feeding themselves and steered clear of any eroticism. These vampires were defined by grotesque facial features, and certain aesthetics such as long fingers and nails in films such as Salem's Lot, Subspecies, and the 2011 remake of Fright Night. Among other entries, 30 Days of Night notably included such characteristics of subspecies of vampires that were driven by their bloodlust and desire to feed on human blood. Physical design and traits. For the most part, the Nosferatu appeared as undead entities with shark-like fangs and black eyes, as well as an overall deadly and grotesque appearance. They were designed to evoke fear in the victims' minds, and they had all the classic traits of age-old vampires, including an enhanced sense of sight, smell, and hearing. Moreover, the Nosferatu could not tolerate sunlight, and their attack on Barrow, Alaska was carefully planned throughout the 30-day-long polar night, when the sun would not rise. Some of these vampires also had powers such as telepathy and teleportation, in addition to camouflaging abilities, and they were resilient beings with the ability to withstand grenade attacks and other deadly explosions. Sometimes their supernatural senses could be subdued or weakened in extreme temperatures, but they had very few weaknesses and were nearly invulnerable. Their bodies were essentially frozen in the state that they were in during their transformation, and they didn't age or decay from this point on. They also didn't suffer from injuries or illnesses like humans, and they could regenerate and self-heal any wound in a matter of seconds. Their senses were enhanced to the point where they were on par with animals such as wolves or tigers, and they were said to be 10 times faster and stronger than human beings. Interestingly, some vampires in 30 Days of Night possessed powers such as genetic memory of the first vampire, and the ability to speak the Nosferatu language, in addition to abilities like teleportation, telepathy, and shapeshifting. Behavior and pack dynamics. The Nosferatu were introduced as apex predators in the 30 Days of Night franchise, and they solely relied on human blood for their survival. In the original comics, Vincente was introduced as the main antagonist, who claimed that he was the father of all vampires. He also had a wife named Lilith and 2 other female vampires in his clan, and he was the one who established rules that forbade them from revealing their identities to humans. His pack had no option but to obey his rules, and Vincente did not take kindly to any disobedience. When Marlowe invited him to a month-long feast in Alaska, Vincente accepted his offer, but was soon enraged when he learned that Marlowe had broken his rule by revealing his true identity to humans. Soon enough, he killed Marlowe, but even his life was short-lived in the comics, as he underestimated Eben Oleman and accepted a one-on-one combat challenge, where Oleman easily overpowered him and killed him. On the one hand, Roderick Marlowe was a supporting character in the comic, where even though he was an elder, he was killed off by Vincente in no time. Marlowe was depicted as a sadistic individual who actually planned the attack on Barrow, Alaska in the first place, but he didn't survive for too long after Vicente got his hands on him. However, his character dynamics were tweaked in the movie, where he appeared as the main antagonist and wreaked havoc on the town of Barrow, Alaska. He took sadistic pleasure in feeding on human blood, and he even turned it into a sport while terrorizing the townsfolk. Marlowe went as far as to manipulate a drifter known as the Stranger into killing all the dogs in the town so that the residents could not escape through the dog sledge. While Marlowe's agent was soon caught and arrested, he didn't seem too bothered and spent most of his time in the holding cell, warning them that they were coming. Soon enough, he was proven right when Marlowe's horde of vampires invaded the town and mauled most of the residents to death. Marlowe further ordered his henchmen to decapitate all their victims to ensure that their bites didn't turn them into vampires as well. He didn't want any more competition, and his sole intention behind invading the town was to feed on human blood for extended periods of time. He also went ahead and killed the Stranger after realizing he was crying out of fear in his holding cell, while his second-in-command just stared at him indifferently. In this way, these vampire clans didn't assign much value to human lives, or even consider them worthy enough to keep them around. Instead, they viewed them as their next meals and soon decapitated them after draining them of their blood. Eventually, Marlowe's tyranny was opposed by the town mayor, Eben, and his estranged wife Stella, who managed to turn the entire town against the vampires. They rallied the residents to oppose their rule and even attack them back, while Marlowe decided to burn the entire town to make it seem like an accident. However, Eben steps up to oppose him and even injects himself with the town deputy's blood after he had recently survived an attack. This soon kickstarts his transformation, where Eben gains enough strength to overpower Marlowe. Even though Marlowe has the upper hand in their fight, Eben eventually punches him in the head, and the punch goes right through his mouth and out the back of his head. While Eben could not have hoped to get rid of the vampire menace, this attack successfully kills Marlowe in an instant, and the rest of the vampires soon scramble back into the darkness as the sun starts to rise. Vampirism and Infection. For the most part, the franchise portrayed vampirism as a virus that could be spread through contact with vampiric blood. In many instances, humans had undergone the transformation process after being bitten or scratched by vampires, or even injecting themselves with vampiric blood. After the vampire's blood coursed through human veins, it triggered several disease-like symptoms before the human was deemed undead. At this point, the infected human would undergo a transformation that would end with him gaining shark-like fangs, black eyes, and talon-like claws, as well as a newfound aversion to sunlight and enhanced senses and strength. Weaknesses and how to kill. The Nosferatu of 30 Days of Night had a typical vampiric weakness to sunlight, and they would catch on fire and end up turning into ash when exposed to sunlight. Other forms of light, including ultraviolet light, also had a similar effect on vampires, such as the time it killed one of Marlowe's mates, Kali. However, these vampires still had a slim chance of returning to life, in case they came in contact with vampire blood and managed to regenerate with its help. While the movies have maintained this weakness throughout the franchise, the Light of Day novel established that the genetically modified variants of Nosferatu no longer had this weakness, and they could hunt down their victims under sunlight. While most vampires could be defeated by exposing them to silver, fire, or garlic, the vampires in this series differed from their mythological counterparts, and were immune to all these classic weaknesses. However, they were vulnerable to traditional decapitation methods, such as beheading or stab wounds through the head. Comparison with classic vampires. As opposed to classic vampires, the Nosferatu in 30 Days of Night were quite modern, and they wore business attire and other regular clothing just like humans. Even though they'd been around for centuries, they had a modern-day aura, and they managed to blend in with great ease. Moreover, they were great at using electronic gadgets and devices such as phones and computers, and these vampires had evolved and come a long way from traditional vampires such as Dracula. However, they did share the same base instincts and desire to feed on humans, and when it came down to their meals, they were just as brutal and ferocious as any age-old vampire. In fact, one could even say that the Nosferatu in this film were far more aggressive and blinded by their bloodlust than classic vampires such as Dracula, as the film rarely ever explored themes of sexuality or eroticism that define classic vampires. Marvelous verdict. And with that, we have explored the typical characteristics of the Nosferatu of 30 Days of Night, and all the ways in which they terrorize the citizens of Barrow, Alaska. While pop culture is crawling with several twists on classic depictions of vampires, the Nosferatu in this film have been slightly overlooked or forgotten, but this doesn't make them any less ferocious than your average modern-day vampire. In fact, they were some of the first depictions of a modern-day spin on the traditional Nosferatu, and their brutal nature most definitely deserves more attention. We hope you enjoyed exploring these cult classic bloodthirsty entities with us, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on the Nosferatu of 30 Days of Night in the comments down below.